Good morning, bro. Let's talk about a story that starts with the kind of peace you only find in the early hours, when the world is still asleep and everything feels possible. Picture this, a city wrapped in eerie stillness, like someone hit the pause button on life itself. The streets are empty except for the flicker of street lamps casting long shadows across cracked pavement. A stray cat darts into an alleyway, its silhouette sharp against the dim light. It's that fleeting moment of calm before chaos wakes up. And trust me, it wakes up. Now enter Cena, a man who craves routine as much as anonymity. He pulls up to a modest bar nestled between two towering buildings. This place isn't fancy. No flashing lights or neon signs screaming for attention here. The sign above is dark, almost forgotten. But there's something about it, something warm, something real. For John, it's a sanctuary where he can sip his drink in peace, away from cameras and crowds that follow him everywhere else. Inside, Kira greets him with a knowing smile. She's got warm brown skin, expressive eyes full of resilience, and a quiet strength that makes you think she could handle anything life throws at her. She's the owner, having taken over the place after her father passed. You can tell she loves this bar. It's not just a business, it's her legacy. For now, all seems right in their little corner of the world. John takes his usual seat, leaning back slightly, enjoying the silence. His hands wrap around his glass like it's an old friend. Outside, the sky is a deep shade of blue, with hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. The air smells faintly of rain from the night before, adding to the harmonious calm. But hold on tight, because we both know this kind of peace doesn't last forever. Something's coming, something big, and when it arrives, nothing will be the same again. The quiet morning didn't last long. Just as John settled deeper into his seat, savoring the silence, the rumble of engines echoed through the streets outside. It started faintly, like distant thunder rolling in, but grew louder and more menacing with every second. Roaring motorcycles filled the air, their guttural growls cutting through the stillness like knives. The sound was jarring, loud enough to make your chest vibrate, and it stopped abruptly just outside the bar. Then came the crash. The wooden door burst open with a deafening bang, kicked in so hard it slammed against the wall. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like trouble personified. He was tall, burly, with a square jaw and a thick beard that screamed, "Don't mess with me." His leather jacket was patched and worn, its surface rough and textured from years of use. Behind him stood three other bikers, each one just as intimidating, their boots scuffing against the floor as they spread out, blocking any chance of escape. Their presence was suffocating. The leader's gaze swept across the room, lingering on Kira behind the counter. A slow smirk twisted his face, cruel and mocking. "Oh, would you look at this?" he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They let anyone work behind the bar these days, huh?" One of his companions snickered, leaning casually against the nearest table, while another cracked his knuckles, flexing his fingers like he couldn't wait to throw a punch. The regulars froze in their seats, sensing danger in the air. Some glanced nervously at John, hoping maybe he'd step up, but for now he stayed silent, observing. Kira, though, she didn't flinch. Her back remained straight, her shoulders squared, even as the weight of 4 pairs of hostile eyes bore down on her. She wiped her hands on a cloth, one deliberate motion, and raised an eyebrow. "What can I get you?" she asked coolly, her voice steady despite the hostility radiating off these men. The leader leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. The leather of his jacket creaked as he moved, loud and abrasive in the tense silence. "Maybe I just want to see how you handle yourself," he sneered, his grin widening. His friends laughed, their amusement low and mean-spirited, filling the small space with unease. But Kira wasn't shaken. Not yet. The leader's grin widened as he leaned further onto the counter, his leather jacket creaking with every movement. His fingers drummed against the wood like an impatient drummer, each tap echoing unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Kira had already prepared his drink, a simple whiskey neat, but instead of drinking it, he picked up the glass and swirled it lazily, inspecting the liquid like a connoisseur who didn't trust what he was being served. "I think I changed my mind," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Without warning, he spit into the glass, letting his saliva mix disgustingly with the amber liquid. Then, with deliberate slowness, he set the glass back on the counter, pushing it away from him. "I don't drink from hands, like yours." His words hit the air like a slap, sharp and laced with undisguised contempt. His gang erupted into laughter again, their amusement thick and cruel, filling the small space with an oppressive energy. For a brief moment, Kira froze, not out of fear but shock. The coldness of his insult wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Her fingers curling slightly around the cloth she had been using, Tio wiped down the counter. She took a slow breath before speaking. "My place is right here," she said coolly, her voice unwavering despite the weight of his stare. "Running my bar. Yours is outside. So get out." The leader's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before twisting into something uglier. He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head slowly. "Oh, sweetheart," he drawled, leaning closer now, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "You don't get to tell me what to do." And then, without warning, he grabbed the glass and flung its contents straight at her face. Cold liquid splashed across her cheeks, soaking into her shirt. A collective gasp rippled through the bar, but Kira didn't flinch. She stood there, her breathing steady, even as droplets slid down her skin. The leader stepped back slightly, smirking again, clearly pleased with himself. One of his men clapped mockingly, "Oh, that was a good one, boss." The others laughed, rough and mean-spirited, feeding off the hostility. But Kira wasn't shaken. Slowly, deliberately, she wiped her hands on the cloth again, her movements measured and precise. Her expression remained calm, almost eerily so. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made the room fall silent. "You made a choice," she said, looking directly at him. "Now deal with it." At her usual table in the corner, John Cena folded his newspaper, setting it aside. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but his posture shifted slightly forward, as if ready to move at any moment. The bikers hadn't noticed him yet, or maybe they dismissed him, but his presence suddenly felt larger than life. The tension in the room crackled like electricity, waiting for someone to flip the switch. The leader's rage was palpable. His wrists still wrapped in a brace from their last encounter, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. "You embarrassed us," he growled, his fingers drumming against the bar counter like a ticking clock counting down to chaos. "Made us look weak." He gestured toward John without even looking at him. And him? He got in the way of something that didn't concern him. John had been silent until now, sitting calmly at his usual spot, his posture relaxed but alert. His hands rested loosely on his knees, but his eyes were sharp, watching every move. When the leader finally turned to face him, John spoke for the first time since the bikers entered. His voice was calm but firm, each word landing with precision. "You mean your way," he said, tilting his head slightly. The leader smirked, clearly unimpressed. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" He shook his head, his expression darkening. "This isn't about you." His tone hardened as he locked eyes with John. "This is about respect." John didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward just a fraction, his tone steady and unyielding. "You want respect?" he asked, his voice carrying an undeniable weight. "Earn it." The room froze. The tension crackled like electricity, thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers shifted restlessly, sensing the storm brewing between their leader and this stranger who refused to back down. Then, without warning, the leader grabbed a bottle from the bar and swung it at John's head. But John moved faster. With effortless grace, he dodged the attack, the bottle smashing harmlessly against the counter behind him. Before the leader could recover, John countered with brutal precision, a single punch to the stomach that knocked the wind out of him. The leader staggered back, coughing, his face twisted in pain. That was all it took. The bar erupted into chaos. The other bikers lunged forward, their movements chaotic and fueled by anger. But John wasn't fazed. He moved like a force of nature, every action deliberate and calculated. One biker tried to grab him from behind, but John twisted out of his grip, driving his knee into the man's ribs before slamming him onto a nearby table. Another swung wildly, but John blocked the punch effortlessly and countered with a devastating elbow strike, sending the man crumpling to the ground. Amidst the chaos, Kira acted instinctively. When she saw the leader pull out a knife, her heart skipped a beat, but fear didn't paralyze her. She grabbed the closest heavy object, a metal tray, and swung it with all her strength. The impact against the leader's wrist made him grunt in pain, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. John seized the opportunity. Grabbing the leader by the collar, he twisted his body and slammed him down onto the counter. The man groaned, dazed and defeated. The remaining bikers hesitated, their bravado crumbling as they realized they weren't winning this fight. And then came the sirens. The leader's rage boiled over. His wrist, still wrapped in a brace from their last encounter, trembled as he lunged forward, grabbing a bottle off the counter. "Enough of this," he growled, swinging it straight at John's head with enough force to shatter bone. But John moved like water, fluid and unstoppable. He ducked just in time, the bottle smashing harmlessly against the wall behind him, shards of glass raining down. Before the leader could recover, John countered with brutal precision. A single punch to the stomach sent the man stumbling back, gasping for air. The sound of his wheezing echoed through the bar, but there was no time to savor the moment. The other bikers sprang into action, their movements fueled by adrenaline and anger. One biker charged at John, fists flying wildly. It was chaos that felt like it could spin out of control at any second. Chairs scraped against the floor as terrified patrons scrambled out of the way. Tables overturned, drinks spilled, and the once quiet morning dissolved into sheer pandemonium. But John wasn't fazed. He sidestepped the first attacker effortlessly, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and slamming him face first onto the counter. Bottles rattled, glass shattered, and the man crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Another biker swung at him, aiming for his ribs. John blocked the punch with his forearm and retaliated with a devastating uppercut that doubled the man over. With a swift motion, he grabbed the biker by the collar and tossed him onto a nearby table, which collapsed under the weight with a loud crack. But the fight wasn't just John's, it was Kira's too. When she saw the leader pull out a knife again, her heart skipped a beat. This time, she didn't hesitate. Grabbing the closest heavy object, a metal tray, she swung it with all her strength. The impact against the leader's wrist made him grunt in pain, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. John seized the opportunity. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the leader by the collar, twisted his body, and slammed him down onto the counter. The man groaned, dazed and defeated. The remaining bikers hesitated, their bravado crumbling as they realized they weren't winning this fight. And then came the sirens. The leader's rage was palpable. His wrist, now wrapped in a brace from their earlier encounter, trembled as he lunged forward again, grabbing another bottle off the counter. "Enough of this," he growled, swinging it straight at John's head with enough force to shatter bone. But John moved like water, fluid and unstoppable. He ducked just in time, the bottle smashing harmlessly against the wall behind him, shards of glass raining down. Before the leader could recover, John countered with brutal precision. A single punch to the stomach sent the man stumbling back, gasping for air. The sound of his wheezing echoed through the bar, but there was no time to savor the moment. The other bikers sprang into action, their movements fueled by adrenaline and anger. Chairs scraped against the floor as terrified patrons scrambled out of the way. Tables overturned, drinks spilled, and the once quiet morning dissolved into sheer pandemonium. But John wasn't fazed. He sidestepped the first attacker effortlessly, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and slamming him face-first onto the counter. Bottles rattled, glass shattered, and the man crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Another biker swung at him, aiming for his ribs. John blocked the punch with his forearm and retaliated with a devastating uppercut that doubled the man over. With a swift motion, he grabbed the biker by the collar and tossed him onto a nearby table, which collapsed under the weight with a loud crack. But the fight wasn't just John's, it was Kira's too. When she saw the leader pull out a knife again, her heart skipped a beat. This time, she didn't hesitate. Grabbing the closest heavy object, a metal tray, she swung it with all her strength. The impact against the leader's wrist made him grunt in pain, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. John seized the opportunity. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the leader by the collar, twisted his body, and slammed him down onto the counter. The man groaned, dazed and defeated. The remaining bikers hesitated, their bravado crumbling as they realized they weren't winning this fight. And then came the sirens. The red and blue lights flashed through the frosted windows, casting an eerie glow over the wreckage inside. The sound of screeching tires outside signaled the arrival of reinforcements. 2 officers stormed in, their hands hovering near their holsters as they took in the scene before them. Their eyes swept over the fallen bikers, the broken tables, and finally landed on John, who stood completely untouched in the center of it all. One of the officers, an older man with sharp eyes and a steady posture, exhaled sharply as recognition dawned on his face. "Cena," Officer Taylor said, shaking his head. "You know, one of these days, you're gonna have a quiet morning like a normal person." John smirked. "Not likely." Taylor turned his attention to the leader, who was now standing completely still, his jaw clenched tight. "That true?" he asked, gesturing toward the mess. "These men caused all this." Kira stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "They came in looking for trouble. They harassed me, insulted me, and when I asked them to leave, they attacked." She glanced at John. He stopped them before they could do any worse. Taylor studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "All right, let's get these guys cuffed." His partner moved quickly, pulling out handcuffs and snapping them onto the leader's wrists. One by one, the bikers were hauled to their feet, groaning in pain as they were led toward the door. As they passed John, the leader turned back, his eyes filled with barely contained rage. "This isn't over," he spat. John didn't even acknowledge the words. He simply watched as the bikers were escorted outside, their threats meaningless in the face of reality. Taylor sighed and turned back to John. "You really don't know how to take a quiet morning, do you?" He smirked slightly, then gave Kira a nod. "You need anything, you call." With that, the officers left, taking the last of the chaos with them. The bar was a mess, broken tables, shattered glass, chairs scattered everywhere, but it was over. Kira leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "I should probably be freaking out right now," she muttered. John sat back down at his usual spot, completely unfazed. "But you're not." Kira exhaled and shook her head. "No, I'm not." She looked around at the mess, then at John. "You sticking around for another drink?" John smirked. like always. The morning after the second brawl felt different. The bar was quieter than usual, almost eerily so. Regulars filed in, their faces carrying a mix of curiosity and unease. Kira moved through her routine with practiced ease, but there was a tension in her movements, something unspoken yet palpable. Every now and then, she caught snippets of whispered conversations about the fight, the bikers, and most importantly, John Cena. "Did you hear what happened?" one patron muttered to another at a corner table. 3 of them went down like they were nothing. Kira couldn't help but smirk as she wiped down the counter. She glanced over at John, seated in his usual spot, sipping his drink as if nothing had changed. His presence was steady, unwavering, a silent reassurance that whatever came next, he wasn't going anywhere. "You've been the talk of the town," Kira said, leaning slightly on the counter as she refilled his glass. Her voice carried a playful edge, though her eyes betrayed the weight of everything they'd been through. "People like to talk," John replied simply, his tone calm but measured. He didn't seem fazed by the attention, nor did he seek it. For him, this was just another chapter in a life full of challenges. Kira set his drink down and crossed her arms. "Yeah, but this time they're talking about how you knocked out 3 bikers like it was nothing." She raised an eyebrow, challenging him to acknowledge the absurdity of it all. John took a slow sip before responding. "They started it." Kira chuckled, shaking her head. "And you finished it." Before the conversation could go further, the door swung open. A man stepped inside, his suit clean but slightly wrinkled, his expression tense. He wasn't a regular, and the way his eyes scanned the room suggested he was looking for someone specific. When he spotted Kira, he immediately approached the bar. "You're the owner?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Kira straightened up, her demeanor shifting instantly. "Yeah. Can I help you?" The man glanced around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then, leaning in slightly, he spoke in hushed tones. "I heard what happened here yesterday, with those bikers." Kira's expression darkened slightly. "Yeah? What about it?" The man hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Look, I run a diner a few blocks away. Last week, they came in and did the same thing, harassed my staff, smashed some tables, scared off customers. I didn't know what to do. I thought calling the cops would only make it worse." Kira listened intently, her grip tightening ever so slightly on the cloth in her hands. The man continued, his voice trembling with frustration and fear. "They came back yesterday, right after they left here. They broke a window, knocked over chairs, said they weren't done with this neighborhood." Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "They're not the kind of people who like losing." "No," the man agreed, swallowing hard. "That's why I'm here. I wanted to warn you. Be careful. These guys, they don't give up." A heavy silence settled over the bar. The reality of the situation was clear. These men weren't just some punks looking for trouble. They were used to getting their way, and now that someone had stood up to them, they weren't going to let it slide. John finally broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "If they come back, I'll be here." The man looked between Kira and John, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Kira smirked, her confidence returning. "Last time they were here, they left in handcuffs." The man nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "Just be careful." With that, he turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Kira leaned against the counter, deep in thought. "So they're not done," she muttered under her breath. "They never are," John replied, his expression unreadable. She looked at him, studying his face for a moment. "You've dealt with people like this before." John met her gaze, his eyes sharp and steady. More than you know. Kira exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Great. Just what I needed. John smirked slightly. You're handling it better than most. She gave a short laugh, though there was no real humor in it. Yeah, well, I'd rather not have to handle it at all. The bar buzzed with nervous energy, a stark contrast to the quiet that had defined its mornings just days before. Kira moved methodically through her routine, but there was an edge to her movements now, an unspoken awareness that danger wasn't far behind. She wiped down the counter, checked the inventory, and rearranged chairs, all while glancing at the door more often than she cared to admit. Each creak of the hinges sent a jolt through her chest, even though it was usually just another regular walking in. John remained seated at his usual spot, his posture relaxed but alert. He hadn't left the bar yet, and Kira knew why. His presence wasn't just about keeping her company, it was a silent promise that he wouldn't let anything happen again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Officer Taylor's warning echoed in her mind, they're planning something big. Those words lingered like smoke after a fire, refusing to dissipate no matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else. The diner owner's visit earlier hadn't helped either. His fear had been palpable, his voice trembling as he recounted how the bikers had returned to his place after being humiliated here. They broke a window, he'd said, his eyes darting around as if expecting them to burst in at any moment. Knocked over chairs. Said they weren't done with this neighborhood. Kira exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the counter. Her knuckles turned white under the pressure. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when everyone was looking to her for answers. Even the regulars seemed uneasy, their conversations quieter, their laughter forced. They glanced toward John occasionally, reassured by his unwavering calm, but the tension in the air was undeniable. You think too much, John finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost casual, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room like a hawk watching for prey. Kira raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly against the counter. Easy for you to say. You're not the one running a business they've decided to target. John smirked faintly, taking a slow sip of his drink. And yet, I'm still sitting here. Kira rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable. If they come back, I'm not letting you clean up the mess afterward. Fair enough, John replied, setting his glass down with a soft clink. But they will come back. She froze for a moment, her fingers tightening around the cloth in her hands. You sound pretty sure about that. I am, he said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Men like them don't forgive easily. They'll want to prove something, to themselves and to everyone else. Kira exhaled, rubbing her temples. Great. Just what I needed. John leaned forward slightly, his expression serious now. Listen, Kira. When they do come back, it won't be like last time. They'll bring more people, maybe weapons. They'll try to take control of the situation before we can react. Her stomach tightened at the thought, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. So what do? We prepare, he said firmly. We make sure they know they're not welcome here. And if they don't listen, he paused, his jaw tightening slightly, then we show them why. Kira studied him for a moment, searching for hesitation or doubt, but found none. Instead, she saw resolve, a quiet determination that made her feel just a little safer despite everything. All right, she said finally, her voice steady. Tell me what to do. The stillness of the night felt unnatural, almost suffocating. The usual hum of the city outside the bar was there, but something about it seemed off. The tension from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. John remained seated at his usual spot, his body language calm but his eyes sharp, constantly watching the door. Kira continued to work, pretending not to notice how often she glanced toward the entrance herself. Every sound from outside sent a small jolt through her, though she refused to let it show. And then it happened. The low guttural roar of motorcycle engines broke through the night, growing louder as they approached the bar. The sound was different this time, more bikes, more men. The deep growls of their engines filled the street before cutting off one by one. Then came the heavy footsteps, the slow, deliberate approach of men who wanted to be heard before they were seen. The door swung open, but this time no one kicked it in. The bikers didn't charge in like before. Instead, they walked in slow and controlled, their presence even more threatening because of it. The leader from the previous day stood front and center, his wrist now wrapped in a brace, his expression dark with barely restrained fury. But he wasn't alone. There were more of them now, 7 men in total, their leather jackets worn, their faces hardened. They spread out, positioning themselves strategically, making sure no one could easily slip out. The bar fell into an eerie silence. The few remaining customers who hadn't left yet froze, their drinks forgotten, their movements stilled. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just a visit. This was a message. "You made a big mistake," the leader said, his voice low but dangerous. His gaze locked onto Kira, who stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her expression remained neutral, though her fingers tightened slightly around the fabric. "You're back," she said simply, her tone carrying a calm defiance that masked the storm brewing beneath. The leader's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Did you really think this was over?" Kira exhaled slowly through her nose, her shoulders squared. "I was hoping it was." The bikers chuckled darkly, their amusement laced with malice. The leader leaned on the counter, his fingers drumming against the wood, a rhythmic tapping that echoed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "You embarrassed us," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "Made us look weak." He gestured vaguely toward John without even looking at him. And him? He got in the way of something that didn't concern him. His eyes flicked back to Kira, narrowing dangerously. "So now we settle this, the right way." John finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You mean your way." The leader smirked, finally turning to face him fully. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" He shook his head, his expression twisting into something uglier. "You don't get it. This isn't about you." His voice dropped to a growl, each word landing with precision. "This is about respect." John tilted his head slightly, his posture relaxed but ready. "You want respect?" he asked, his tone steady and unyielding. "Earn it." The room froze. The tension crackled like electricity, thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers shifted restlessly, sensing the storm brewing between their leader and this stranger who refused to back down. Then, without warning, the leader grabbed a bottle from the bar and swung it straight at John's head. But John moved faster. With effortless grace, he dodged the attack, the bottle smashing harmlessly against the counter behind him. Before the leader could recover, John countered with brutal precision, a single punch to the stomach that knocked the wind out of him. The leader staggered back, coughing, his face twisted in pain. That was all it took. The bar erupted into chaos once again. The other bikers lunged forward, their movements fueled by anger and desperation. But John wasn't fazed. He moved like a force of nature, every action deliberate and calculated. One biker tried to grab him from behind, but John twisted out of his grip, driving his knee into the man's ribs before slamming him onto a nearby table. Another swung wildly, but John blocked the punch effortlessly and countered with a devastating elbow strike, sending the man crumpling to the ground. Amidst the chaos, Kira acted instinctively. When she saw the leader pull out a knife again, her heart skipped a beat, but fear didn't paralyze her. She grabbed the closest heavy object, a metal tray, and swung it with all her strength. The impact against the leader's wrist made him grunt in pain, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. John seized the opportunity. Grabbing the leader by the collar, he twisted his body and slammed him down onto the counter. The man groaned, dazed and defeated. The remaining bikers hesitated, their bravado crumbling as they realized they weren't winning this fight. And then came the sirens. The bar was a mess. Broken tables lay scattered across the floor, their surfaces cracked and splintered. Shattered glass glittered under the dim lights like jagged stars on the wooden planks. Chairs were overturned, some broken beyond repair, others leaning precariously against the walls where they'd been flung in the chaos. The air smelled faintly of spilled alcohol and sweat, a lingering reminder of the storm that had just passed. Kira leaned heavily against the counter, her fingers gripping the edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her damp shirt clung to her skin from earlier, but she didn't seem to notice, or care. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her curly hair, which had loosened slightly during the fight. Her face was calm, though exhaustion lingered in her eyes. Despite everything, there was a quiet strength in her posture, a resolve that hadn't been there before. John sat back down at his usual spot, completely unfazed by the destruction around him. He reached for the clean glass Kira had set out, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His hoodie was still intact, his jeans barely scuffed despite the brawl he'd just walked away from. As he poured himself another drink, he glanced up at Kira, his expression unreadable but steady. "You should probably be freaking out right now," he said, his tone light but laced with sincerity. Kira let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, I'm not." She paused, looking around at the wreckage. "Doesn't mean I won't later." John smirked faintly. "Fair enough." Officer Taylor stood near the entrance, surveying the scene one last time. His sharp eyes swept over the broken furniture, the shattered glass, and finally landed on John. "You know," he said, crossing his arms, "I should start charging you for all these visits." Kira rolled her eyes, grabbing a broom. "Put it on my tab." Taylor smirked, then turned serious again. "We'll make sure these guys don't come back. They're going away for a while." He nodded toward John. "And you," he hesitated, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know if I should be thanking you or arresting you for destruction of property." John shrugged, taking a slow sip of his drink. "They started it." Taylor sighed, shaking his head. Yeah. He gave Kira a final nod. "You need anything, you call." With that, the officers left, taking the last of the chaos with them. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was relieved. The weight of the night lifted slightly, leaving behind an almost surreal calm. Kira began sweeping up the shards of glass, her movements methodical. She glanced at John occasionally, watching as he sipped his drink, his presence as solid and unwavering as ever. For the first time since the bikers had stormed in days ago, she felt safe, not because the danger was gone, but because she knew she could handle whatever came next. "You sticking around?" she asked, breaking the silence. John smirked. "Like always." Kira chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Guess I'll see you tomorrow morning." "Bright and early," John replied, setting his glass down. As the city outside continued its restless pace, the bar felt like a sanctuary once more. It was battered, bruised, but still standing. And so was Kira. She glanced around at the mess, then at John, who sat quietly at his usual spot. There was a newfound sense of empowerment in her chest, a quiet pride that no amount of intimidation could take away. But even as the tension faded, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. These men weren't the kind to disappear forever. Still, she refused to let fear dictate her life. This was her bar, her legacy, and no one was taking it from her.
And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.